Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Introduction. Imagine waking up to the world on the brink of nuclear war. The sky looks the same. Life seems normal. But behind closed doors, leaders are making decisions that could destroy entire cities within minutes. This was the terrifying reality in October 1962, when the world stood closer to nuclear annihilation than ever before. For 13 tense days, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a deadly standoff over nuclear missiles stationed just 90 miles from American shores. A single miscalculation, a misunderstanding, or an impulsive decision could have triggered a full-scale nuclear war, one that no one would have survived unscathed. But how did we get to this moment? What led two superpowers to the edge of destruction? And what choices, made in secret under unimaginable pressure, ultimately saved the world from disaster? In this video, we'll dive deep into the Cuban Missile Crisis, exploring the high-stakes chess game between the US and the Soviet Union that led to the crisis, the top-secret intelligence discoveries that exposed the presence of nuclear missiles in Cuba, the nerve-wracking negotiations and near-catastrophic moments where war seemed inevitable, the leaders, spies, and unsung heroes who helped defuse the crisis at the last possible moment. This is not just a history lesson. This is a story of how humanity came within a hair's breadth of nuclear Armageddon, and how the right decisions, made at the right time, saved us all. The context. The Cold War and nuclear arms race. To truly understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have to go back to the Cold War, a decades-long struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that shaped global politics, military strategies, and even everyday life. This wasn't a conventional war with battlefields and front lines. It was a war of ideology, espionage, and the looming threat of nuclear destruction. The US-Soviet rivalry. After World War II ended in 1945, two superpowers emerged: the United States, championing democracy and capitalism; the Soviet Union, USSR, promoting communism and a state-controlled economy. While they had been allies against Nazi Germany, their fundamental differences in governance, economics, and world vision quickly turned them into adversaries. The result? A global power struggle, where each side sought to expand its influence. This rivalry played out in various ways. The division of Germany, with the US supporting West Germany and the Soviets controlling East Germany. The Korean War, 1950-1953, where the US and its allies fought to stop the spread of communism. The space race, as both nations competed to prove technological and military superiority. But no aspect of the Cold War was more terrifying than the nuclear arms race. The arms race, a world on the brink. By the late 1940s, both the US and the USSR had developed nuclear weapons, and the race to build bigger, more powerful bombs accelerated at an alarming pace. 1945. The US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending W2 and proving the devastating power of nuclear weapons. 1949. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, eliminating America's monopoly on nuclear power. 1952. The US developed the hydrogen bomb, hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. 1955. The Soviets also developed an H-bomb, ensuring mutual destruction if war ever broke out. This led to the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, MAD. The idea that if either country launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate, with equal or greater force, wiping out both nations and possibly the entire world. With thousands of nuclear warheads on both sides, tensions escalated, and both superpowers looked for ways to gain an advantage. That's where Cuba enters the picture. The Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961. A disaster that pushed Cuba closer to the USSR. Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, was once a close ally of the United States. But in 1959, Fidel Castro led a revolution, overthrowing Cuba's US-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista. At first, the US wasn't sure what to make of Castro, but when he began nationalizing American businesses, aligning with the Soviet Union and promoting communist policies, Washington saw him as a threat. In April 1961, the U.S., under President John F. Kennedy, launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, a secret plan to overthrow Castro using CIA-trained Cuban exiles. The operation was a total disaster. The exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs, expecting to spark an uprising against Castro. Instead, Cuban forces crushed the invasion within days. Kennedy refused to send U.S. air support, fearing direct involvement would start a war. Castro declared victory and tightened his ties with the Soviet Union. The Bay of Pigs humiliated the U.S. and convinced Castro that he needed stronger protection against another American attack. Why Cuba aligned with the Soviet Union after the failed invasion? Castro turned to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev for military support. The USSR saw this as an opportunity to establish a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere, right on America's doorstep. For the USSR, placing nuclear missiles in Cuba would counter U.S. missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, which directly threatened the Soviet Union. For Cuba, Soviet protection meant securing its communist revolution and deterring future U.S. invasion attempts. This set the stage for one of the most dangerous confrontations in world history, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where a single wrong move could have led to nuclear war. Discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba. By October 1962, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were already high, but the situation took a dramatic and terrifying turn when American intelligence made a shocking discovery. The Soviets were secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. This revelation instantly transformed the Cold War from a tense standoff into an immediate crisis that could lead to nuclear war. October 14, 1962. The U-2 spy plane's shocking find. The discovery began with a routine reconnaissance mission. The United States regularly used high-altitude U-2 spy planes to monitor Soviet and Cuban activity. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 plane flew over western Cuba and captured a series of high-resolution photographs. At first glance, the images appeared to show construction sites and long cylindrical objects. But when experts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, analyzed the photos, they identified something far more alarming: Soviet nuclear missile launch sites. The next day, intelligence analysts confirmed the worst. The Soviet Union had smuggled nuclear missiles into Cuba and was actively building launch facilities. These were medium-range ballistic missiles, MRBMs, capable of striking targets 1,200 miles away, which meant they could hit Washington, D.C., New York, and nearly half of the United States. There were also signs of intermediate-range ballistic missiles, IRBMs, under construction, which could reach almost the entire U.S. mainland. This was no longer a distant Cold War threat. Nuclear warheads were now just 90 miles from American shores. The urgency, a race against time. The intelligence report sent shockwaves through the White House. For the first time in history, an enemy power had placed nuclear weapons within striking distance of the U.S. mainland. Previously, Soviet missiles had to be launched from Russia, giving the U.S. several hours of warning time in case of an attack. But these missiles in Cuba could reach American cities in just 5 to 10 minutes, leaving almost no time for defense or retaliation. A surprise Soviet first strike could cripple the U.S. before it even had a chance to respond. Even worse, the missile sites were rapidly approaching operational status. Once fully armed, the balance of power would shift dramatically in favor of the Soviet Union, and the U.S. would be vulnerable like never before. JFK's dilemma: military action or diplomacy. President John F. Kennedy now faced an unimaginable decision. The stakes couldn't be higher. If he acted too aggressively, he could trigger a full-scale nuclear war. But if he did nothing, the U.S. would be at the mercy of Soviet nuclear missiles. Kennedy and his advisors quickly gathered in secret to discuss their options. The situation boiled down to two choices: immediate military action, launch airstrikes to destroy the missile sites before they became operational. Possibly follow up with a full-scale invasion of Cuba to remove Castro and Soviet forces entirely. The risk? This could provoke Soviet retaliation, not just in Cuba, but possibly in Berlin or even the U.S. itself. Diplomatic and strategic response. Confront Khrushchev and demand the immediate removal of the missiles. Use naval blockades or economic pressure. to force Soviet withdrawal. The risk? The missiles could still be launched before diplomacy succeeded. Kennedy knew that one wrong move could lead to nuclear catastrophe. Over the next 13 days, he would have to navigate one of the most dangerous moments in human history, where a single decision could mean the difference between peace and global annihilation. The 13 Days of Crisis. Internal U.S. response from October 16 to October 28, 1962, the world held its breath as the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded. For 13 agonizing days, nuclear war seemed almost inevitable. Every decision made by President John F. Kennedy, JFK, and his advisors could mean the difference between peace and catastrophe. The first 3 days of the crisis were spent in complete secrecy as U.S. leaders scrambled to process the shocking intelligence and decide on a response. Should they launch immediate military action, or was there another way to neutralize the Soviet threat without starting World War III? Day 1, October 16, 1962. The crisis begins early in the morning. President Kennedy was briefed on the U-2 spy plane photographs. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy showed him the undeniable evidence. The Soviet Union had installed nuclear missile sites in Cuba. JFK's first reaction was disbelief. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had personally assured him that the USSR would not place offensive weapons in Cuba. The discovery meant that the Soviets had directly lied to the U.S., escalating the Cold War to its most dangerous moment yet. Formation of XCOM, the brain trust behind the response. Kennedy immediately convened a top-secret advisory group known as XCOM, Executive Committee of the National Security Council. This group included Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother and closest advisor, CIA Director John McCone, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Maxwell Taylor. This team would debate and shape America's response to the crisis over the next several days. Their challenge was immense. Respond forcefully enough to remove the Soviet missiles, but without triggering World War III. Day 2, October 17, 1962. The debate begins. Airstrikes versus naval blockade. The members of XCOM quickly split into two opposing camps, each pushing for a different approach. Option 1, airstrikes and invasion, the military's proposal. The U.S. Air Force strongly advocated for an immediate airstrike to destroy the missile sites before they became operational. Some military leaders, including General Curtis LeMay, pushed for a full-scale invasion of Cuba to remove Fidel Castro altogether. Their argument? This was a direct act of aggression by the Soviet Union, and the U.S. needed to strike before the missiles were armed. However, airstrikes carried enormous risks. The U.S. had no guarantee that it could destroy all the missiles before some were launched. An invasion of Cuba could provoke Soviet retaliation in Europe, particularly in West Berlin, a key Cold War flashpoint. Worse, if even one nuclear missile was fired at an American city, millions could die. Option 2, a naval blockade, the political approach. The State Department and civilian advisors, including Robert F. Kennedy and McNamara, argued for a naval blockade, or what they called a quarantine. Instead of bombing Cuba, the U.S. would use its Navy to stop Soviet ships from delivering more missiles. This would buy time for diplomacy and force Khrushchev into negotiations. A blockade was seen as a middle ground option. It was a show of strength without directly attacking Cuba or the USSR. It would give the Soviets a chance to back down without immediately escalating to war. It left open the option for military action later, if needed. However, even this plan was risky. If a Soviet ship ignored the blockade, the U.S. would be forced to fire on it, potentially triggering a direct war. Khrushchev could respond by blockading Berlin, cutting off West Germany from the rest of Europe. Day 3, October 18, 1962. JFK makes his decision, a naval quarantine. The debate in XCOM was fierce. Military leaders pushed hard for airstrikes, believing diplomacy was too weak. But JFK was deeply skeptical. He feared an airstrike could spiral into a full nuclear war. He also knew that attacking Cuba could destroy U.S. credibility, as it would look like an unprovoked first strike. He wanted a response that gave Khrushchev an exit strategy, rather than cornering him into war. By the end of the day, Kennedy made his decision. The U.S. would impose a naval quarantine around Cuba. The U.S. Navy would surround Cuba and intercept any Soviet ships carrying military supplies. Any ships refusing to turn back would face potential military action. The U.S. would also demand that the Soviets remove the missiles already in Cuba. The world still didn't know. Yet at this point, everything was still top secret. The American public and even U.S. allies had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. JFK deliberately delayed announcing the crisis so that he could prepare a clear, controlled response instead of acting impulsively. But as Soviet ships continued moving toward Cuba, carrying even more nuclear weapons, the moment of truth was approaching fast. Would the Soviets back down, or would this blockade ignite the war the world had feared for decades? The next 10 days would determine the fate of the world. Day 4-8. Global tensions rise. By October 22, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis was no longer just a secret discussion among U.S. leaders. It became a full-blown global emergency. President John F. Kennedy took the unprecedented step of directly addressing the American people and the world, exposing the Soviet nuclear threat in Cuba. The response was immediate: fear, panic, and the real possibility of World War III. October 22, 1962. JFK's televised address. The world holds its breath at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Millions of Americans tuned in as President Kennedy delivered one of the most important speeches in modern history. The White House had kept the missile discovery a secret for nearly a week, but now the world was about to learn just how close it was to nuclear war. JFK's key messages in the speech, revealing the Soviet threat. Kennedy showed the world clear evidence that the Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. He explained that these missiles were capable of striking nearly every major U.S. city in minutes. Announcing the U.S. response, the U.S. was imposing a quarantine, naval blockade, around Cuba, preventing further Soviet weapons from reaching the island. He demanded the immediate removal of the nuclear missiles already in Cuba. He warned that any missile attack from Cuba would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union itself, with full retaliation. A final warning to Khrushchev. Kennedy called on the Soviet leader to de-escalate the crisis. He left room for diplomacy, saying the U.S. did not want war, but would not back down. The reaction? Fear, panic, and a world on edge. The moment JFK finished speaking, panic swept through America and beyond. Stockpiling begins across the U.S. Citizens rushed to grocery stores to buy food, water, and supplies, fearing a nuclear war was imminent. Schools conduct nuclear drills. Teachers instructed children to duck and cover under their desks in case of an atomic blast. Families build fallout shelters. Many rushed to construct underground shelters, believing they might need them. Within days, the world watches in fear. American allies in Europe, Latin America, and Asia braced for a possible Soviet retaliation. The public fully grasped how close the world was to destruction. This was no longer just Cold War politics. It was an existential threat. October 23, 24. The U.S. military at DEFCON 2, one step from nuclear war in response to JFK's announcement, the United States military raised its alert level to DEFCON 2, the highest level ever reached in history. What is DEFCON 2? DEFCON, Defense Readiness Condition, is a 5-level military alert system. DEFCON 5, Normal Peacetime Conditions. DEFCON 4, Heightened Intelligence Monitoring. DEFCON 3, Increased Readiness. DEFCON 2, Armed Forces are ready to deploy for war within hours. DEFCON 1, Imminent Nuclear War. By moving to DEFCON 2, the U.S. military was now preparing for full-scale nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Strategic Air Command, SAC bombers loaded with nuclear weapons were sent into the air 24/7, ready to strike Soviet targets at a moment's notice. Missile silos were armed, and the U.S. Navy prepared to intercept Soviet ships heading toward Cuba. The world had never been closer to global nuclear annihilation. October 24th, the moment of truth. Soviet ships keep coming with the naval blockade. In place, U.S. warships patrolled the waters around Cuba, waiting for the first Soviet ships to arrive. If the Soviets refused to turn back, war would begin. Over a dozen Soviet ships, including oil tankers and freighters, were en route to Cuba, carrying weapons and supplies. JFK had ordered U.S. naval forces to stop and inspect any ship attempting to breach the blockade. The world now waited. Would the Soviets defy the blockade, forcing the U.S. to act? On the morning of October 24th, U.S. intelligence reported that Soviet ships were still heading straight for the blockade line. If they did not stop, the U.S. would have no choice but to fire upon them, igniting the war everyone feared. At 10 a.m., the White House received an urgent update. Some Soviet ships had slowed down or changed course, but not all of them. A handful of Soviet vessels, including a submarine carrying nuclear torpedoes, continued toward the blockade. Would the United States be forced to engage? Was this the moment war would begin? The next 48 hours would be the most dangerous of the entire crisis. Day 9/11. The standoff intensifies by October 25 to 27, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis had reached its most dangerous phase. U.S. forces were on full war footing. The Soviet Union refused to back down, and the world teetered on the edge of nuclear catastrophe. Both sides now faced a terrifying choice: negotiate or fight. October 25th. The U.S. prepares for invasion, with Soviet ships slowing down but refusing to turn back completely. President John F. Kennedy and his military advisors took the next step, preparing for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Military readiness escalates. More than 120,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Florida, ready to storm Cuban beaches. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were on alert, prepared to parachute into Cuba within hours if ordered. Navy warships, aircraft carriers, and submarines encircled the island, ready for combat. Strategic Air Command, SAC bombers carrying nuclear warheads remained airborne 24/7, prepared to strike Soviet targets if necessary. At this point, the U.S. was mere moments from initiating an invasion, an act that would almost certainly trigger a Soviet response and escalate into nuclear war. However, Kennedy remained hesitant about pulling the trigger. He knew that an invasion would lead to massive American and Cuban casualties, almost certainly provoke Soviet retaliation, possibly in West Berlin or even against the U.S. mainland, increase the risk that the Soviet Union would launch its own nuclear missiles. As the immediate U.S. military prepared for war, a last-minute diplomatic effort began behind the scenes. Secret back-channel negotiations begin while official government talks between the U.S. and Soviet Union stalled. A back-channel opened between Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother and Attorney General, and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. Dobrynin and RFK met in private, away from the eyes of the press and military. The Soviets hinted that Khrushchev was open to a deal, but needed assurances that the U.S. would not attack Cuba. The U.S., meanwhile, demanded a guarantee that the Soviet missiles would be removed permanently. Despite these talks, tensions continued to rise. The world was still dangerously close to war. October 26th, Khrushchev's first letter, A Possible Way Out. On the night of October 26th, a new and unexpected development occurred. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent a personal letter to President Kennedy. Unlike the usual formal, cold diplomatic messages, this letter was emotional and personal, a desperate attempt to find a peaceful resolution. What Khrushchev's letter said: a proposal for peace. Khrushchev offered to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a simple U.S. promise. The United States must pledge never to invade Cuba. He argued that the missiles were only defensive, meant to protect Cuba from another U.S. invasion, like the failed Bay of Pigs. A plea to avoid disaster, Khrushchev wrote with urgency, warning that the world was on the brink of an unimaginable catastrophe. He urged Kennedy to think not just as a leader, but as a father and a human being, emphasizing that war would mean the destruction of both nations. A hope for a peaceful coexistence. Khrushchev acknowledged the hostility between the U.S. and USSR, but insisted that they could find a way to coexist without nuclear war. This letter was a breakthrough, but also a test. Was Khrushchev sincere, or was this just a Soviet trick? JFK and his advisors had to decide quickly. Could they trust the Soviet leader? Was this a real opportunity to end the crisis, or just a stalling tactic? And if the US accepted this deal, would the Soviets actually follow through? The fate of the world now rested on the next 48 hours. Day 1213, the crisis peaks. October 27, 1962, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. The crisis had entered its most dangerous phase, one where a single miscalculation could trigger full-scale conflict. A US spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Soviet Premier Khrushchev sent a second, more aggressive demand. Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, met secretly with the Soviet ambassador in a last-ditch effort for peace. The next 24 hours would determine the fate of the world. October 27th, the U-2 incident, a spark that could ignite war. On the morning of October 27th, a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance plane was flying over Cuba, gathering intelligence on Soviet missile sites. Without warning, a Soviet surface-to-air missile, SAM, shot it down. Why this was a huge crisis? The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was killed, the first and only U.S. casualty of the crisis. This was an act of war. The U.S. military now had justification to strike back. JFK's advisors pushed for immediate retaliation, fearing the Soviets were escalating the crisis. Inside the White House, Kennedy was furious but cautious. He asked, was this a direct Soviet order from Moscow? Or was it an unauthorized action by local Soviet commanders in Cuba? It turned out to be the latter. Soviet forces in Cuba, feeling threatened, acted without Khrushchev's direct approval. JFK knew that if the U.S. launched an attack in response, Moscow would have to respond, leading to an unstoppable cycle of escalation. Against his military advisors' recommendations, Kennedy held back from striking. He realized that diplomacy was still the best hope for avoiding nuclear war. Khrushchev's second letter, a new demand as the U.S. grappled with the U-2 incident. A new crisis arrived. Khrushchev sent a second letter to JFK. This time, his tone was harsher and more demanding. Khrushchev's new proposal, he repeated his original offer. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade. But now, he added a new demand. The United States must also remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. This was a major complication. The U.S. had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Turkey near the Soviet border as part of NATO's defense strategy. These missiles could strike Moscow within minutes, just as Soviet missiles in Cuba could hit U.S. cities. Why this was a problem for the U.S. Public perception. If Kennedy agreed to remove the missiles, it could look like the U.S. was backing down under Soviet pressure. NATO allies. The U.S. had placed the missiles in Turkey as part of its commitment to European allies. Removing them might damage trust within NATO. Political risk. The American public and Congress might see this as a weak response, especially after weeks of tough talk. Now JFK faced a huge dilemma. Reject Khrushchev's new demand and risk war. Accept the deal and face backlash from his own military and political leaders. With time running out, Kennedy's most trusted advisor, his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, stepped in. Robert Kennedy's secret meeting with the Soviet ambassador. That same evening, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, met privately with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin in Washington, D.C. This was one of the most crucial moments of the entire crisis, a secret back-channel negotiation that would determine whether the world would go to war or find a way out. The key points of the meeting. RFK delivered a warning. The U.S. would not tolerate Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. If no agreement was reached soon, the U.S. would take military action, possibly within 48 hours. The U.S. offer, a secret deal. The U.S. was willing to quietly remove its missiles from Turkey, but not immediately and not publicly. The removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey could not be part of the official agreement. Instead, the U.S. would dismantle the missiles later, as long as it was not seen as a direct trade for Cuba. A diplomatic way out. RFK emphasized that President Kennedy wanted peace, not war. He asked Dobrynin to relay the message to Khrushchev as quickly as possible. This secret negotiation gave the Soviets a way to save face. They could withdraw their missiles from Cuba without looking weak, knowing the US would remove its missiles from Turkey later. The fate of the world now rested on Khrushchev's response. Would he accept the deal? Or would the crisis spiral out of control? The answer would come within hours. Resolution. How the crisis ended by October 28, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, arguably the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war, finally reached its resolution. After 13 days of intense brinkmanship, secret diplomacy, and global fear, both the United States and the Soviet Union stepped back from the edge of catastrophe. October 28th, Khrushchev announces Soviet missile withdrawal early on the morning of Ts. October 28th, a message from Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was broadcast over Radio Moscow. It was an official announcement to the world. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the United States pledged never to invade Cuba. This was a major victory for diplomacy, but it wasn't the full story. Behind the scenes, the U.S. had also secretly agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey, a detail that was never made public at the time. The secret U.S. concession, removing missiles from Turkey, while the public believed Kennedy had won. The crisis outright, the reality was more complicated. The U.S. had Jupiter nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey, capable of striking Moscow within minutes. Khrushchev's second letter had demanded that these missiles be removed in exchange for Soviet withdrawal from Cuba. The U.S. officially refused to link the Cuban and Turkish missile situations, but in a secret deal, Kennedy's administration agreed to quietly remove the missiles within a few months. However, to preserve the U.S.'s global image, the withdrawal of the Jupiter missiles was not publicly acknowledged as part of the Cuban deal. This allowed both sides to save face. Kennedy could claim victory by forcing the Soviets to back down. Khrushchev could tell his inner circle that he had secured a secret American concession. How nuclear war was barely averted. Looking back, it is astonishing how close the world came to nuclear war. If JFK had ordered an attack on Cuba, Soviet forces on the island were prepared to launch tactical nuclear weapons, which would have escalated the conflict into full-scale war. If Khrushchev had refused to back down, the U.S. military was ready to invade within days. If the U-2 spy plane incident had triggered retaliation, the chain reaction could have been unstoppable. Ultimately, calm leadership, back-channel diplomacy, and the ability to compromise saved the world from catastrophe. The aftermath and consequences. The Cuban Missile Crisis had long-lasting effects on both U.S.-Soviet relations and global nuclear policy. The hotline was established. A direct communication link between Washington and Moscow was set up to avoid future misunderstandings that could lead to war. Nuclear diplomacy changed. Both the U.S. and USSR realized how dangerous the arms race had become, leading to future arms control agreements. Khrushchev's political downfall. While Kennedy emerged stronger, Khrushchev's reputation within the Soviet Union suffered. 2 years later, in 1964, he was removed from power. The U.S. quietly removed its missiles from Turkey. In April 1963, the U.S. dismantled its Jupiter missiles in Turkey, fulfilling the secret deal with the Soviets. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved that nuclear war was not just a theoretical threat, but a real and terrifying possibility. It remains one of history's greatest lessons. Humanity's survival often depends on the decisions of a few, made in the most intense moments of crisis. How close were we to war? Even though the Cuban Missile Crisis ended peacefully, the world was far closer to nuclear war than most people realized at the time. A single miscalculation, a misunderstanding, or a moment of panic could have triggered a nuclear exchange between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Here are the terrifying moments that nearly led to catastrophe. The Soviet submarine incident. The near launch of a nuclear torpedo, one of the most dangerous moments of the crisis, didn't happen on land. It happened deep beneath the ocean. On October 27, 1962, the U.S. Navy was enforcing its quarantine around Cuba. American warships detected a Soviet submarine, B-59, and began dropping depth charges, small explosives meant to force the sub to surface. What the Americans didn't know: the submarine had a nuclear torpedo, a weapon powerful enough to destroy an entire fleet. The submarine's crew was cut off from communication with Moscow. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed war had already started and wanted to launch the torpedo at the U.S. fleet. The man who stopped nuclear war, Vasily Arkhipov. The only reason a nuclear launch didn't happen was one Soviet officer, Vasily Arkhipov. Soviet protocol required all 3 senior officers on board to agree before launching a nuclear torpedo. Savitsky and another officer were ready to fire, but Arkhipov refused. He argued they needed to surface and await orders from Moscow. Because of Arkhipov's decision, the submarine surfaced, preventing what could have been a full-scale nuclear war. The dead hand system. The Soviet officer who refused to launch another little-known event occurred almost 20 years later, in 1983. But it was directly tied to the Cuban Missile Crisis because it revealed how dangerously automated nuclear warfare had become. The Soviets had developed a system called Perimeter, nicknamed Dead Hand, a semi-automated system designed to launch nuclear missiles if Soviet leadership was wiped out in an attack. In September 1983, Soviet radar incorrectly detected a U.S. nuclear strike. The Soviet officer in charge, Stanislav Petrov, had mere minutes to decide whether to report the attack, an action that would have triggered an immediate Soviet nuclear response. Petrov disobeyed protocol. He judged the radar signal as a false alarm and did nothing. His decision prevented nuclear war. Later investigations confirmed it was a malfunction in the Soviet radar system. This event showed how fragile the world's nuclear systems were. A computer glitch or human error could have led to global annihilation. Miscommunications and the danger of human error throughout the crisis. Misunderstandings and miscommunications nearly led to disaster. The accidental U-2 flight over the Soviet Union. On October 27, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane accidentally flew into Soviet airspace. Soviet MiG fighter jets scrambled to intercept it. The U.S. sent fighter jets armed with nuclear missiles to escort the U-2 back to safety. If the Soviets had shot down the U-2, the U.S. response could have triggered war. Conflicting messages from Khrushchev. Khrushchev sent 2 different letters to the U.S. The first letter, October 26th, was conciliatory, offering to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. no-invasion pledge. The second letter, October 27th, was more aggressive, demanding the U.S. also remove its missiles from Turkey. U.S. officials weren't sure which letter to respond to. Ultimately, they ignored the second one and publicly accepted the terms of the first letter, helping de-escalate the crisis. 4. Long-term effects. How the crisis changed. Nuclear policy. The Cuban Missile Crisis forced the world's superpowers to rethink their approach to nuclear weapons. The Hotline Agreement, 1963. One of the most immediate changes was the creation of the Washington-Moscow Hotline, a direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin. This was meant to avoid misunderstandings that could lead to accidental war. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, 1963. In the aftermath, the US, the Soviet Union, and the UK signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, space, and underwater. It was the first major step toward arms control. The beginning of détente. While the Cold War continued, the Cuban Missile Crisis convinced both sides that they needed better diplomatic channels to prevent nuclear war. Over the next 2 decades, the US and USSR negotiated several nuclear arms agreements, including SALT, ASTOR in 1972, and SALT II, 1979, to limit the growth of nuclear arsenals. Conclusion. A crisis that changed the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. If not for a few key decisions, by Vasily Arkhipov, JFK, and even Khrushchev, the outcome could have been catastrophic. The crisis exposed the flaws in Cold War-era nuclear strategy, how easily miscalculations could escalate into full-scale war, how miscommunications and misunderstandings nearly led to disaster, how individual decisions, often made under extreme pressure, could determine the fate of millions. Because of this crisis, world leaders realized that nuclear war had no winners, only total destruction. It forced both the US and the Soviet Union to rethink their approach to nuclear weapons and pave the way for future arms control agreements. While the Cold War continued for another 3 decades, the Cuban Missile Crisis remained a stark reminder of how fragile global security really was. Conclusion and legacy. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in world history, a moment when the world stood on the edge of nuclear war and stepped back just in time. It was a lesson in diplomacy, brinkmanship, and the terrifying reality of nuclear weapons. What the crisis taught the world. The events of October 1962 changed global politics forever and taught several key lessons. Nuclear war is a real threat. The crisis proved that global destruction wasn't just theoretical, it was a real possibility. Both superpowers had to rethink their approach to nuclear weapons. Diplomacy matters. War was avoided not because of military action, but because of secret negotiations, back-channel diplomacy, and strategic compromise. Miscommunication could have ended civilization. The crisis exposed how easily misunderstandings and miscalculations could escalate into nuclear war. This led to better communication between world leaders. There are no winners in nuclear war. The crisis forced both the US and the Soviet Union to recognize that an all-out nuclear war would have no winners, only total destruction. How it changed US-Soviet relations. The crisis didn't end the Cold War, but it fundamentally changed how the US and Soviet Union interacted. The Hotline Agreement, 1963. A direct communication line between Washington and Moscow was established to avoid future misunderstandings. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, 1963. Both nations agreed to limit nuclear testing, marking the first step in nuclear arms control. More caution in the arms race. While the arms race continued, both superpowers became more careful about direct confrontations. The beginning of détente. In the 1970s, the US and USSR entered a period of reduced tensions, signing arms control agreements like SALT I and II. Though the Cold War lasted until 1991, the Cuban Missile Crisis ensured that both superpowers avoided another direct nuclear standoff. Final question. Could this happen again? While the world has changed since 1962, nuclear tensions still exist. The threat of nuclear war has not disappeared. Conflicts between nations like the US, Russia, China, and North Korea continue to raise concerns. Modern technology has made nuclear weapons even deadlier, and misinformation spreads faster than ever. The biggest lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Diplomacy, communication, and rational decision-making are the only ways to prevent catastrophe. The crisis wasn't just history, it was a warning, call to action. If you found this fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our other Cold War history videos. There are so many untold stories from the Cold War, moments that changed history but are often forgotten. Comment below, do you think something like the Cuban Missile Crisis could happen again? Let's discuss.